Welcome to the Public Sector Executive Podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Media Group. In this episode, Tanya Arnold is joined by a group of experts to discuss the topic of electric vehicle infrastructure. With the world moving towards increased EV use, the infrastructure required for charging those vehicles is now becoming vital. How this infrastructure is rolled out, who pays for it, and where it's situated are all key questions being asked by people around the country. Before we jump into the discussion, if you're listening to this edition of the podcast but would rather watch it, we are now publishing our podcast in video format as well. You can head over to the Public Sector Executive YouTube channel to watch along. Tanya, take it away.
Electric vehicle infrastructure is transforming the way that we travel, driving a cleaner, greener future. With 8,670 new UK charging points added in early 2025, that's a 27% rise to over 82,000 reliable, accessible networks. They're accelerating adoption, underpinning sustainable transport innovation and the journey towards net zero emissions. But challenges remain. EV infrastructure still struggles with unreliable charging, uneven access, funding cuts, planning delays, grid strain, and low consumer confidence. Well, to address this, our panel is Anna Krajinski, the Director of UK Transport and Environment, Claire Sharp, Electric Vehicle Project Manager for Thames Valley Berkshire Local Enterprise Partnership, Peter Higgins, EV Projects Officer for Stoke-on-Trent City Council, Jack Adams, the EV Infrastructure Project Manager for Wakefield Council, and Mark Fletcher, EV Lead for London Councils. Anna, can I just start with you? When you look across the UK, what does the picture look like? Is there an even spread of EV charging, or have we still got pockets that are very good and pockets that are left out?
Absolutely the latter. So what we see when we've done our recent study around charger rollout across the UK, that there's no clear north-south divide, which people often talk about. There's pockets of charging being rolled out fantastically across the north of England and pockets of really low charger rollout in the south as well. And what we really see is that there's some areas like Cornwall, for example, that are storming ahead, Brighton is storming ahead, London storming ahead, and then there's other places that are falling behind. When we looked at how Levi funding's, for example, been allocated in the last few years to charger rollout, it seems to not have been targeted necessarily at the areas that need it most, but rather equally divided alongside all UK local authority areas, which might be part of the problem why the areas that need the most funds and the most investment in charging aren't levelling up as fast.
So Claire, when you look at the projects that you've got going, how easy is it to persuade people to switch to electric vehicles?
I think it's still a challenge. I mean, we're still under 5% of the cars on the road in the UK that are electric. So we've still got a way to go. But we ran an EV engagement event in Berkshire in July, and we're really actually pleasantly surprised on the level of interest, both from the number of people coming, which was 2.5 times what we were expecting. We had about 250 people attend a regional event, and the dealers that came along. We had some fantastic test drive vehicles, including 4 Porsche test drives, up to 100,000 cars willing to let the public test drive them. So that was there was a lot of buzz and a lot of excitement, and we're running more events across the region, including one this Saturday in Wokingham. So yeah, I think people are getting on the journey, but they learn best from neighbours and from hearing proper case studies, I think. So it's important to share the stories. Your EV drivers.
Jack, you've got a phrase, right charger, right place. What do you mean by that?
So it's very easy to say from an outside perspective that the right answer is to stick a rapid charger at every single point because it allows the fastest charging and it's going to amplify usage across the UK. However, this isn't really appropriate because we have all the other restraints. There's grid restraint, you've got your battery health, long-term battery health to consider, and the cost of the infrastructure to put in. The higher the speed of charging, the larger the grid supply, and the more expensive the hardware. So really, we've got to view on where people are going to be and what length of time they're going to be there. If we use somewhere like Legoland, for example, If we go to the kind of home counties, people will be there for 6 to 8 hours. I imagine the average must be over 5. So you don't want a rapid charge that charges the car in 25 minutes for the customers that are using those car parks. You would want a slow charger to charge across the time they're going to be in the park. So that's kind of a location-based thing, but we can look at that on the on-street infrastructure. If we're looking at overnight parking, the speed of the charging could be much, much lower than if we're on a motorway services. So really taking that approach of looking at dwell times and how people use their vehicles, and then putting a charging in that's appropriate for that is kind of that philosophy. And we've taken that approach across West Yorkshire. As Levi is a West Yorkshire programme, obviously being delivered individually by councils, but that philosophy is across our delivery across the region.
Jack, sorry, Peter, you've got a big project, haven't you, with cross pavement charging? You know, if you are in, and we'll get to Mark in a moment, if you are in those sort of city areas, charging is a real issue, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Nationally, 25% of people don't have access to a driveway to charge their EVs, which is a major stumbling block to EV ownership, because one of the key drivers to EV adoption is the ability to charge your vehicle up on your own domestic tariff at a considerably cheaper rate than public charging infrastructure. Locally in Stoke-on-Trent, that's 57% of our household stock doesn't have access to off-street parking. So it's sort of imperative, especially within urban areas such as Stoke-on-Trent with higher percentages of people without driveways, to offer the same equity of EV ownership across the board. And then there's the issue of those with reduced mobility. I've been doing a lot of work recently with my cross-pavement project with Motability. And whilst Levi may be great, putting all this public charging infrastructure around, it may not be suitable for everyone. Someone with reduced mobility might not be able to access the public charging infrastructure that we're putting in place.
So, Mark, come to you. I mean, London has its whole a whole different issues. You'll have the whole cross pavement parking. I mean, you've got huge numbers, obviously, of tower blocks and all the rest of it. How do you tackle EV infrastructure in the City of London?
I mean, in some ways, that the issues in London are similar to other areas, but they're probably more magnified. So we've got, as you say, a higher proportion of households than elsewhere that don't have off-street parking. We have more tower blocks. We have, so I think, as Jack mentioned, that right charger in the right place is really important to think about, and how we improve that sort of the equity of charging offer, and make it electric vehicle ownership more accessible to more people. That will look different in different areas. I think one of you talk about sort of cross pavement as potentially being one way to tackle some of that. That's not without its own problems. And actually, as a drive, there are questions as to what degree does that to cross pavement solutions drive increased EV uptake. I think you're probably likely to get one if you've already got an EV, rather than encourage you to get one. They're looking to sort of address issues of proximity to charge points and affordability. So I think if we think about those things more broadly, rather than think about specific solutions, we think about how do we make charging more accessible to more people. That goes to the accessibility point, for people with physical impairments. It goes to affordability. There's been some, there's a recent government grant around purchasing new electric vehicles. That's welcome. But how can we make better use of the infrastructure that we've got and that we're going to deliver? And that will look different in each area. And I think we trust local authorities to know their areas the best and come up with the best solutions for that.
So what are some of the projects that you're seeing that aren't the cross pavement charging?
Well, so I mean, firstly, we talked about Levi. Levi is going to massively increase the number of on-street charge points. I think, how do we make those more affordable? So, we're that's happening. There's also non-Levi sort of delivery that's happening. That we're going to see a massive increase in the number of publicly available charge points. There's also boroughs are looking at delivery on their estates, their housing estates, and in tower block car parks and things like that. So we're seeing a whole range of the different projects that you would expect to see. Sort of categorize it as one particular type of thing. I think we're seeing a whole range of different options which offer that range of slow charging, fast charging, ultra rapid charging, to meet the needs of just not just of households, but of business as well. I think business transition is going to be an important one when we think about affordability of electric vehicles. I think one of the sort of the things that's holding that back slightly is fleets transitioning to electric vehicles, and then the availability of second-hand vehicles, which are cheaper. I think a lot of the electric vehicles that we've seen so far are at the premium end, which are out of reach to a lot of people in terms of making that EV transition.
Claire's Porsches that they were test driving. They sounded good fun, but not necessarily the most accessible.
No.
If I can switch to some of the questions that we've got coming in. We have had 2 or 3 about reform and their views on the environment. I'm not entirely sure that those are suitable for this panel, so forgive me, but we're not going to ask those. And Tony, I hope we've answered your question about driveways already. Paul White says, what of the embodied carbon problems around lithium batteries and its minings, body and frame manufacture, rubber and PM 2.5s, he knows more about this than me, on air quality? Anna, do you want to take that one up? Yeah, go on, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to take that. So when we look at the latest manufacturing techniques for electric vehicles, very quickly the life cycle emissions of the vehicle production and the use are much, much better for an EV than an internal combustion engine car. We're seeing, for example, BMW recently published some figures where it suggests that it's less than 20,000 miles that we have that carbon cost of production for electric vehicles breaking even. When we look at mining, of course, the EU is just implementing regulation to ensure there are due diligence rules on manufacturers to ensure a sustainable and just supply chain to minimize the environmental and social costs of mining. And it has to be remembered as well that once you take that material and you produce a battery or an EV, the majority of that material can then be recycled at the end of the vehicle's life and be used in another EV or potentially used for batteries for home storage or for supporting the grid. Whereas when we do that extractive process for fossil fuels, we just burn that fossil fuel and we never see it again. And we have to go and we have to extract more. On the PM 2.5 emissions, we have to remember that EVs have regenerative braking, so they use the motor to brake. So there, the emissions are lower than for internal combustion engine vehicles. And of course, when it comes to tailpipe emissions, all of the toxic PM 2.5 that is associated with the internal combustion engine and especially diesel cars is eliminated. We don't have any of that pollution. We also don't have the toxic nitrous oxides and carbon monoxide that comes out of the tailpipe of other vehicles. So what the improvements that we're really seeing in air quality, whether that be in London or other cities and towns across the UK, is really being driven by this switch to cleaner and electric cars, vans and trucks.
Paul Wheatley says, what experience do members of the panel have in convincing communities that EV chargers and vehicles connected to them won't be the subject of tampering or vandalism when connected to on-street or public car park charging infrastructure, particularly in rural areas? Jack, knowing Wakefield, you have some fairly large rural areas as well as the city. Do you want to take that one?
It's a really difficult question at the moment. So we have some existing charges on a contract where we have had vandalism. We had the cables taken off the mobile cutters, which came at quite a considerable cost to our supplier to replace and put them back on. I think it's difficult to know how we prevent some of this from a local authority perspective. but the manufacturers of the charge points are moving forward with technology. So we're seeing identifiable cables, we're seeing kind of identifying liquids put into the heavy charger cables. But really, we need to ensure that when we do installs in areas which could be considered higher risk, that we have good CCTV, that we have lighting, which are generally good practice anyway, because people want to feel safe when they charge. So we don't want to be putting chargers into dark, horrible corners anyway. So there is a mix of steps we can take, but I feel that ultimately we are a little bit at the mercy of kind of the criminals and policing on this as a local authority. We can only take certain steps and hope that the market moves forward with identifiable methods and we have a good policing strategy.
Kez Sleeman asks, is the long-term intention with cross-pavement charging solutions to have a cable channel for every household? Are there concerns around the impact of the installation and maintenance of other utilities if there are hundreds of cable channels on a street that would need to be reinstated after any works? Peter, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I thought this one would be mine. I think the main issue we're experiencing, not just in Stoke but in other areas with cross pavement installations into the pavement, is that the record of where the cables are in the pavement isn't necessarily as accurate as it should be. But that's a problem that's going to happen for every local authority, and not just for cross pavement, for any new installation that goes into the pavement environment. It is certainly the intention of Stoke-on-Trent Council to open up cross-pavement charging to any resident without off-street parking. So that may mean having neighbouring properties with a cross-pavement solution. In regards to the installation, there are safety devices fitted to the chargers themselves, such as RCD and open pen for protection, along with the safety devices of the vehicles themselves, would reduce the risk of any sort of issues to do with the installation of the electrical system there to next to zero. The calculations that I've done, because I've had to do some quite extensive work on this, would be to, without going into too much detail, you're looking at over 1 in 100 million risk of somebody getting a shock from an EV on charge. And just to point out that there are no recorded cases of anybody getting a shock from an electric vehicle on charge, be that at home or from public charging infrastructure.
That's good to hear. Matthew Snedger says, we see drive-through coffee shops and fast food restaurants installing EV chargers. When will the supermarkets start offering charging? Why have they not been early adopters?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody want to pick up on that? Are you working with any supermarkets in your area, Claire? Oh, go on, Jack.
I was going to say, we ran a scheme in across West Yorkshire and in Wakefield a few years ago, and we saw Asda take part and have EV chargers installed, and that was in 2020 and 2021. But kind of anecdotally, outside my work, I can see plenty of supermarkets near me are installing EV chargers. Sainsbury's have committed to building their own EV charging network. And then not far from me, Lidl are installing chargers quite a rapid pace.
And can you work with them to provide an overnight service? Because that's, so it's obviously one of the key things that, they are in generally nearby where people live and things like that. And that problem with not having somewhere to charge overnight, that is the slow charging. That
becomes a difficult question. So some places, obviously supermarkets have leased car parks from local authorities. That's quite common when they build their kind of out of town or just out of town centre, a large piece of land. But a lot of them are looking at these more commercially. So Sainsbury's committing to their own network, it might be difficult to partner with them as they're viewing this as more of a commercial model for their shoppers. It's going to replace kind of their petrol pumps ultimately in the next 20, 30 years. So we'll certainly not rule out those opportunities where they come, but we've just got to be aware that we are working on slightly different models to supermarkets. They want to provide charge for their customers to kind of fuel their cars in the kind of 45 minutes to 1.5 hours they're going to be in their supermarket, whereas we're looking at providing a kind of more affordable charging, maybe at slower rates for residents.
And Matt Edwards, who works for Hastings, said many local authorities are facing challenges with the long-term management of existing EV charge point infrastructure. For example, our insurer has recently deemed charge points in multi-storey and below-ground car parks too high a fire risk, requiring expensive fire suppression systems that weren't part of the original installation. This raises the real risk of having to decommission around half of their public charge points. In situations like this, who can local authorities turn to for support and guidance, whether technical, regulatory, or financial, so that we can maintain the infrastructure and give people public confidence? Anna, is that one for you? Oh no, Jack's in again. Go for it, Jack.
There's Mark might be more aware of this, but there's a very interesting report done by the City of London and the London Fire Brigade into underground EV chargers, the risks and what preventative measures to take. That would be worth looking up and maybe taking to your insurers, because the risks are much lower than parking up a load of petrol and diesel vehicles, which apparently are safe according to the insurance, I'm presuming.
Mark, do you know about that report?
Aware of it, but I haven't read it in detail. But I know that there's a number of London boroughs who have, and one springs to mind now, that has their fleet depot essentially underground, and had the I think it was the country's first megawatt charger. So I think if they can do it, I think there must be ways around it. And look, if I can't remember the name of the person who asked the question, wants to get in touch, happy to have my details passed on, and we can put them in contact.
Great stuff. So Matthew Snedeker says, what are the practicalities of offering community charging hubs in densely populated areas where local residents access charging at zero profit or even subsidized rates operated by local authorities? Anybody looking at that?
Well, I know. So TfL have a project, and GLA have a project where they're looking at rapid charging hubs in locations around London. What I would say is that they're serving different purposes. Rapid charging hubs are looking to, as Jack's described, provide people with sort of mid-journey charging, rapid charging. Local authorities are not exclusively, but are tending to looking at the sort of slower overnight charging, and so they will have different uses, and therefore they're not. I wouldn't say they're mutually exclusive in terms of the offer.
Kez Sleeman has sent in a couple of questions. I'm going to roll them together. How do we account for the additional load on the grid from EV charge points which use existing domestic connections rather than new connections associated with on-street charging? And what data do we need in order to ensure the rollout of public EV charging infrastructure is equitable and that charge point operators don't simply deliver to the most profitable sites? Anna, is that one for you?
So I can cover the first part, perhaps. It's quite a long question. So there's already quite a lot being done by electricity operators to incentivize charging domestically around times when the overall load on the grid is at its lowest. So, for example, between the hours of 12 till 5 a.m. in the morning, often the price has been offered to people with EVs charging during that time are incredibly low, around 7 pence per kilowatt hour. So if you do have access to that charging, that's driving a lot of demand for EV charging to be shifted towards that period, purely on the cost savings that can be achieved from that. We also have a vehicle to grid technology being rolled out in EVs by manufacturers. So what this allows people to do is to charge their electric cars when there's an excess of renewable electricity, for example, prices are low, and then discharge to support the grid when demand is high and, let's say, generation is lower than needed. So EVs have a role not just as off-takers of electricity, but they can actually help support and balance the grid and the system. And we've heard, for example, from National Grid that if you use EVs in this way, you can halve the amount of additional grid infrastructure that needs to be put in for the green transition.
Sam Riches asks, do we have any recommendations about how to manage access to on-street public chargers so EV drivers needing to charge don't find that their chargers are blocked? Cross-pavement charging can only work if the EV driver can actually park where they need to. Peter, are you going to jump in on that? That's another one for you, I think.
Of course. Yeah. From someone who lives in a terrace property in the city, I can only speak from my own experience, both living there and from what I've seen elsewhere around the city of Stoke-on-Trent, at least, that it would suggest that most people who park on street, so in terrace properties and the like, usually if they can't park directly outside their own property, it's because one of their immediate neighbours, be that left, right, or across the road, is parked there anyway. And that may just be a simple case of asking to swap places with a neighbour. I've discussed this with our elected officials, and they're actually trying to spin a positive of this. It may actually increase community cohesion, because usually you don't have an opportunity to speak to your neighbour, and actually being able to just have a simple engagement like that, or even offer, if you have a cross-pavement solution, offering out to neighbours for small-scale community sharing of charging infrastructure. There may be something that is beneficial, but realistically speaking, most people only need to charge their EVs at home once or twice a week anyway. So as long as you can park outside your property once or twice a week, any sort of influence on parking stresses is probably redundant.
I hope that answers your question, Kaz Self, because they're about to roll it out. It was about exactly that, squabbles within in the street. I've got time for one more, I think. Dom Napier, have the panel experience, or would they consider a decentralized ultra-fast hub that's powered by private wire solar farm and battery to remove grid constraints and provide a future-proof solution for vehicles that soon could take apologies, what kind of charge that is. Anybody looking at an ultra-fast hub within the community? No, blank faces on that. I'll try one more then.
I think the issues with that one, sorry, I'll just jump in with that one. I think the issues with that one, if it's all locally generated with a solar farm, if that's my understanding of the question, is you then need a battery capacity to store that. So you'd need a really robust business model to ensure that you're going to get regular usage to make sure that you're not wasting any sort of electricity. And I think the cost of both the generation technology and the storage technology would probably outstrip any sort of commercial gains that either a business or a local authority could get from the charging infrastructure itself.
I've got shed loads of questions and we're over time. I'm going to just go for one more, which was, what would you advise for a large secondary school who want to install charging points? We're in outer London. Mark, what would you advise?
Well, I suppose you want to think about who you're looking to serve with that. Is it for employees? Is it for parents? And you might have different considerations there. But I suppose what I would suggest is, first of all, contact your local authority. And I think I saw that the question was from Croydon, so contact Croydon, but also speak to some charge point operators. In some situations, they'll install the equipment for free, and they make their money off people using it and charging it. So I would say, contact your local authority, see what they've got planned in and around your area, and also do some market engagement. Speak to some charge point operators.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Public Sector Executive Podcast. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to all of our channels to really get the most out of all the public sector insight we publish, and make sure you don't miss a thing.